promise that they said yes to it. One. It's amazing. You know, would be no cities if we had to go through the channel. Well, you know, this it's cheap. You know, minimum. It's nothing. Well, it's actually, you know, they've given us
Okay. Let me do it. I just need,
Well, you know, I wanted to say about this. I said to them, you know, would you support this chart of actions? I said, absolutely. So, Ricky and I have to work out what that is.
He does have cat.
We're on the same. This is great, Saskia. It's great. We're next to each other on the podium. And there are two time zones.
But I don't understand why it's so. I'm looking for is my clock. It's not 10:20. Just give me two. I have my. I know exactly when I want to start. Right. All right, shall we start? I want to welcome you all. My name is Saskia Sassen, and I just wanted to briefly talk about how this Audi project started, and also welcome everybody, and especially the diversity of speakers. Some of them traveled long distances, who are quite a mix in terms of backgrounds, in terms of obsessions and ideas, and in a way are a parallel space to the diversities, etc., that we have in the city. I think whenever one addresses a subject that has to do with the city, this notion of something that is diverse and incomplete, you can never cover it all. And so when I brought these speakers together, and many of them have never met, so this is not a little, familiar group, I was quite aware I did that knowingly in case one of the speakers is amazed, why was I put on that panel with that person? That is actually the design. The fantasy, a bit of fantasy, is that things will happen. It's like encounters in urban space where the unexpected idea or disagreement can generate, something more. Now, I must say, let me just tell you how I wound up getting a very generous gift from Audi Foundation and from Audi, no, not from the Urban Initiative Foundation at Audi. Audi is a car manufacturer. I have never owned a car in my life. I'm not planning on owning a car. But I must say, so the CEO of Audi, Mr. Stadler, an enormously intelligent person, heard me give a talk and some of you have heard me give this talk, called Urbanizing Technology. I wasn't thinking cars at all, mind you. And so my concern was, what happens when we subject beautifully designed technologies that are elaborated, constructed, tested in experimental zones, in research labs, when they are subjected to messy environments. Now, these environments don't necessarily mean the crowded streets of Mumbai. They don't even necessarily mean a city. But I chose the urbanizing vector because that is a grand sort of way in which you can think of a big mess, something that can mess up the most perfectly invented object. We who live in New York, we know that that happens regularly. But there was also hanging in there this notion that the car, especially because the car is such a dominant feature in our lives and problematic very often, that the car could also have an interesting encounter with a crowded city. And some of you have heard me say that. But my notion was sort of, does the city have the capacity to talk back? And does it? So I just wrote a little article that I really loved writing, which was entitled, Does the City Have Speech? Speech as in the legal category. In other words, a complex voice. And I, a bit hypothetically, but a bit as a provocation, said, yes, it does. But the question is, do we remember that language, or have we forgotten that language that the city speaks? Now, the image of the car is a perfect example for me, and this is how Stadler came to hear my lecture, I guess, because the car makes visible a lot of that talking back capacity that the city has. So the image is a fantastic car, might be made by Audi, that is made for all kinds of terrain, for high speed, that can handle a lot of stuff. A car is an extraordinarily complex assemblage of forms of knowledge, of types of materials, etc. But when it hits a crowded downtown, all those capabilities are basically neutralized, and it is crawling along. It might as well be a bike, right? And so I say the city has spoken. It says, you go do your stuff somewhere else, but not here. And so out of that then came actually a gift from the Audi Foundation, from this urban initiative at Audi, which is a kind of think tank or foundation. And I was absolutely surprised because, cars is really not something that I've thought about. But then I said, I'll only take this gift if I can do my kind of stuff. And so, but out of that then came this notion of setting up a mini think tank, sort of my mini think tank, very arbitrarily, very laissez-faire, and I invited about 8 people that I really respect who deal with mobilities. And I told them, give me your best. Don't do any generic introduction. Just go to the heart of the matter. I prefer 10 great pages to 40 pages that have all the generic introduction and I don't need conclusions. I just need clashing ideas, etc. And so I am hoping to make a book out of that also, a little book with great visuals, etc., also online. And some of those people that I invited to do this type of work are among the speakers, but there are also speakers who don't belong to that. Now, under this notion of urbanizing technology, which is sort of the organizing idea for me, really, when I think about a lot of these subjects that concern technology, under this idea, I try to bring in a mode of research and a mode of interpretation, and that is the disciplining capacity that a complex, not fully controllable environment has vis-a-vis even the most powerful technology. So in that setting, the car actually emerges as a very interesting case because it is itself so complex and so diverse. But it really, I'm thinking about all kinds of ways in which technologies can be and should be urbanized if they get deployed in cities. So at the other extreme are digital technologies, and I invited several people into my mini think tank who deal with digital technology. So it really is about the mobilities from visible to invisible. There was something else I wanted to mention. Oh yes, and I do want to thank, I always forget this part, I want to thank a limited number of people for the purposes of this little talk here, but besides the CEO of Audi, who gave me this very generous grant without questions asked, no strings attached, etc. He never checks in. He never expects a report on how I'm doing, nothing. So I love that. That's a kind of research gift. If there's any potential donor in the audience that we academics love, and we will forever be grateful, so not that academic gratitude matters much in this world, but there we are. So I want to thank, yes, Mr. Stadler, but also Larissa Brown, who armed. She's a German PhD in political philosophy. Now, that is a big deal. A German PhD is an enormous deal, and in philosophy in Germany is an enormous deal as well. Armed with that, with those instruments, she arrived at Audi to set up this urban initiative, which was like a mini think tank. And I did one big meeting with the top engineers, because I was really interested in different forms of knowledge at Audi. And she was there, and she was the only woman in the room because these were all men engineers, and serious, types, so to say. And she just negotiated her way through all these engineers in a brilliant way, and she really brought into the agenda of this company sort of the set of questions, that I'm asking, and that a few other people, we have several people who have also benefited from the grants here. Diana Barco and Doris Tarchópulos, right, from Bogota. And I think you're the only other team, right, here, right. And she was just fantastic because she spoke from her platform of knowledge, right, which is political philosophy. Now, how she went, that's a long story, and so I really want to thank her because she created the possibility, she created a space, etc., etc. The second person is Catherine Di Paola, who is with Style Park, who is also a fantastic person, etc. And of course, Gardner, the head of the Style Park, who also was a great supporter. Now, so I hope you get the idea about this conference, really, that it is, one way of putting it is clashing ideas, or ideas that pass by each other, that too. Okay? So clashing ideas is a more visual representation. When they pass by, there is a kind of zone of invisibility that I always think of. It needs to be marked. What is this gap? So both of these things. Now, I'm going to briefly introduce speakers as they speak, so I'm not going to introduce all of them now. And the first speaker is Richard Sennett. Since it's in the public domain, I will say, yes, he is my husband, but that's not why he is speaking, all right? He has his own reasons. And he will be speaking about a bigger project that he is engaged in right now called The Open City. But the title of this, of his talk is, I think, quite a stunning title. That's why I think you're the first speaker, Richard, because of the title of that. How motion came to dominate cities. It's something that we don't really think about, but the notion that there would be a city where mobilities are not sort of the marker is a stunning idea. Sennett is a professor both at the London School of Economics and here at NYU. He's the author of many books. There is a recent book that is one of my favorites, The Craftsman, which really deals with the kind of intelligence that resides in the hand. And I think that our technological era is sort of bringing all that stuff back a bit, right? The notion that the hand also carries a kind of intelligence. And Richard you have, I'm putting you on the spot now, you have half an hour and you can decide how much time you give to the audience to ask you questions. How's that? Is that putting all the cards on the table here? Right, okay, very much. Welcome, Richard, please.
Should I sit here or here?
Oh, why don't you stand here? I think this is better.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's wonderful being introduced by you. This is a fantastic experience. Well, what I'm going to talk to you about is this is part of a big project that I'm engaged in on how to make cities more open. And what I'm going to describe to you today is a way that they became more closed, which is the way in which movement through urban space became more important than dwelling in that space. That motion took precedence over dwelling. And as this change occurred, I think we've had a very destructive formulation about actually how to design cities, which has appeared. Most of what I'm going to say to you is historical, and it begins with in 1638, which is the point in early modern history in which the idea of mobility suddenly moves into the urban domain in a distinct fashion, but through the side door, if you like. 1638 is when Harvey publishes his treatise on the heart and the movement of blood in the human body. And as you know, Harvey discovered that the heart was a circulating system and that it regulated the flow of blood through arteries and veins. People didn't really understand this before. This discovery that circulation was necessary for human life, and regular mechanical circulation was important for human life, was an astounding revelation to people, not least of whom were urban planners. For instance, in London, when Christopher Wren thought about rebuilding the city after the Great Fire 20 years later, the idea for him was that, and he's an original in this, that streets function like arteries and veins. That is, he invents the idea of the one-way street by direct analogy to this Harveyan revolution. And I have to say, it takes some time away from you. Wren was also a crack dissector. He, in thinking about how to redesign London, he dissected several dogs to understand, because he thought that the legs of these dogs were like streets in the center of London. Quite bloody story. But the notion that you would model a city, circulation on the city, on the human body, is something that gets picked up in Mannheim in the early 18th century, or by L'Enfant in the redesign of Washington, or in the design of Washington, D.C. at the end of the 18th century. And it has two characteristics. One is to conceive of motion as homeostatic, that is, an absolute balance in a city, just the way it is in the human body. And the second is that free movement, unobstructed movement, is healthy. It's healthy in the body, it's healthy in the city. So that was a kind of join between city and body, very important for urban designers in the wake of this Harveyan revolution. It all turns dark in the 19th century. And it's at this point that my story really kicks in, where the privilege given to unobstructed motion takes on political and economic character, which is destructive to urban form. And I think the best way to do this is to talk about how motion takes precedence over dwelling in space in the reforms that Baron Haussmann made. I'm quite chatty, so I may go on. You'll keep me to time. And I'm going to talk about 4 things here. First is the notion of speed, which really becomes salient in the mid-19th century. People can travel faster than they could in earlier times. There are some, I don't want to go into this, well I do, but I won't go into this in some detail. This has to do with changes in the way cities are paved, use of Belgian pavers. As I say, it's a fascinating subject. It has to do with the first attempts to put carriages on rails. You know, they're horse-drawn. The horses can go faster because the carriages are in rail. And most of all, this change is one in which the cost of manufacturing the carriage goes down, so that for the first time it's possible for people of relatively modest means to own a private carriage. This is an absolute sea change in terms of class in a city like Paris. Before the French Revolution, it took a lot of money to buy a carriage, to maintain it, to maintain the horses, and so on. I'll try. Okay. Is there some... How's that? Is that better? Okay. After the... in the mid-19th century, the cost of transport doesn't become mass transport, but the cost of transport of carriages goes down. So we have, for the first time, speed and individuation, individual motion, get conjoined. The carriages on metal wheels are collective for the public, but the idea is that speed is now something that is tied with individualism, closed carriages. And so that is the first way in which the motion comes to have a new character. It's privatized, and the privatization goes along with acceleration. Now, the second thing about this has to do with the notion of, and I want to say one other thing about that. There's a political side to this as well. One of the great reasons for the success of the revolutions at the end of the 18th century in 1830 and 1848 in France was that the bourgeoisie could not easily escape from the revolutionary crowd. That is, they're just too slow moving. And if you built a barricade, it was possible to trap, as occurred in 1794, to trap people in so that they couldn't move freely. What Haussmann saw was that this privatization and speed that was available to him by these new technologies meant that it would be possible to escape, as he put it, to escape the mob. So that's the political side of the speed as well. That correlates with the second phenomenon. And another thing about this. It's really with the Haussmannian changes to transport of this sort that we begin to get lots of records about the anxiety about not being able to move. people naturalized the notion that they had to go slow in cities before this. They didn't get nervous if they got impeded. It was just the way things were. And you see a kind of physiological anxiety that's starting to be reported by people about the fact that they couldn't move now. You can understand this is founded in the idea that there was, the movement should be free and all of that, but the real thing is that you might be trapped politically, right? And so there's a kind of discourse of anxiety about slowness, political discourse of it, which we begin to see in the 1850s. Do you all know that Haussmann remade Paris between 1851 and 1867? Did I say that? Oh, well, he did. The biggest reform that Haussmann made was to widen and straighten streets. And there is again a political, he cut through the center of Paris, particularly on the north bank, on the right bank. And the idea was to build huge straight streets like the Rue de Sebastopol or Rue Magenta. And the idea about this was that they should be wide enough so that cannon could be two abreast. And the military idea was this, remember, this is an age of revolution, that you'd have cannon firing this way into an area, and cannon firing this way. And his idea was that long, straight, wide streets were the answer to pacifying revolution in Paris. And so that is actually the calculation was what cannon needed to move. The idea about the streets themselves, Haussmann's idea was that the buildings along the street were a liner. They were a liner of the famous Haussmannian house, as you know, is 5-6 stories. Progressively, the servants are on the top. As you go down, it's progressively richer, and the courtyards are filled with service personnel. But the idea is that this reform of the street, of what lines it, is also meant to be a barrier so that the bourgeoisie feels comfortable being in this wide street, and that militarily you can fire over the houses to get into these working class areas. That's the logic of this. So you have a street that's very wide, adapted to cannon, lined with bourgeoisie who feel, after all, they feel safe because, the authorities can get to them. And the houses themselves are made almost like little palais, little palaces, serving the masters and floors on the courtyard and at the top. The important thing about this street design, from our point of view, was that the idea is the street itself should be empty except for transport. This was not to be an inhabited street, and I'll tell you later how Haussmann fucked up in this. But this was supposed to be a street on which there was only carriages, not people. Now, the third thing that Haussmann did was to conceive of the réseau, that is, the networks of transport in the city, as totalized. What do I mean by that? That is that these three réseaux look at the map of the city as a form, as a whole, and design where the streets go in terms of the whole. It doesn't go as with the Reform Sixtus V made in Rome 250 years before, from place to place. That is, you have a transport map, which is an analysis of the city as a whole system, supposedly, independent, and to make that, to rationalize that, places are incidents in the creation of this total map of circulation. Again, it goes back to those bleeding dogs that Christopher Wren had on his table. He wanted to know how you got from, as it were, ear to paw, you know, and the incidents of what lay in between were less important than getting this overall design. And it's at that point that the things that you will notice about Haussmann's Paris, and I'm sorry to say, most cities ever since, is that there's an illogic about getting from one place to another, because there's another logic that's kicked in, which is the logic of the map. You understand what I'm saying about this? So at that point, you get streets which cross for the sake of linear, wide system, cross, for instance, the Place de la République in Paris. Can you all some of that in your mind? One of the world's great traffic jams. Why? Because it's designed by Haussmann, not in terms of being a place, but being an incident on a map. You don't go from place to place. And you certainly don't calculate the structure of streets in terms of people who go from one place within the city to the other. So in sum, speed, the design of the street, and map thinking led to a situation in which movement, for economic and political reasons, took precedence over dwelling in place. Now, the great defeat of Haussmann is the pissoir. The pissoir was invented in 1841 in Paris. Again, we could dwell on this for, it's one of the world's great inventions. It's linked to the notion of making the city more sanitary. The multiple pissoir is called a Vespasian, and that's where you have 3 urinals. And that's invented in 1875. I have a lot of factoids about things that I'd like to forget about, but this is all stuck in my mind. And what's important about this is that the pissoir is a way of sanitizing the street, and it leads to the development on these open, wide streets of outdoor cafes. Because now it's possible to be, before that people just peed on the street, horse manure was rarely collected. It was collected, I think, once every 3 days. Starting in the 1850s, it's collected nightly, and human excrement, with all of its smells, is no longer on the street. And the cafes originally are located near the pissoirs. There's a logic to this. That is to say, you have a couple of beers and you know. Nothing for women, because of course women were not meant to use the cafes. That's something, the women were outdoor cafes. They were meant to go inside, they're sex segregated. But the fact that men were going meant that their wives or their partners would go with them. And so the interiors of the cafes became domestic space. Women brought their children frequently. They were warm, and the men dwelled outside. This was fatal to the Haussmannian project, because now the wide street became a public space, clotted with people. Motion in it impeded. And a large part of the subsequent history, in my view, I tell you all of this, of urbanism and after Haussmann, is to undo that colonization, to return to the vision of privatized motion, an empty space that's conceived in terms of mapping. This is what we see today in Beijing or in Caracas, to take two cities which have built very, very much along in the last 20 years on Haussmannian lines. Now, I just to end this by saying, what's the philosophical effect of these changes I've described on dwelling? Obviously, if you can evacuate a street from people, you evacuate a source of political activity, a point not lost on Chinese urban planners. But I think we could go a little below that. That the converse of this is that when you dwell, you are immobile. You don't move. That is to say that you get something where you stay in some place where you don't need to move around, see other people, where you can be, where you have a kind of knowledge, which is something which is like sitzen verstehen, you know, a knowledge which is about being in one place stably. And that means that your ability to move around the city and use, learn what's happening in the city is cut down. Do you understand what I'm saying? The obverse of the Haussmannian city is the static city in which people look at stability and dwelling as a matter of immobility. Now, I think this is terrible, and that's why I think you should get out of your cars and get on your bikes, or even better, use your feet to move around. That's why I don't think Audi will ever give me a grant. Slower means more inductive reasoning about place. That's what I want to leave you with. Slower means more inductive reasoning about place. You're not moving through, you're not having that kind of very restricted kind of information from the outside that modern cars give us, but rather you're reasoning about where you are as you move. And I would say this is also a much more, getting out of your cars and getting on your bikes or your feet is a much more collective experience of movement. So that's to me what the subject of your conference, looking at this as an urbanist, is about. How is it that movement does not destroy places? That's the question I hope by the end of the day you'll answer. Did I talk too long?
No, you didn't talk too long given the subject, but we do have a bit of time for questions. If anybody has a question, I think there are mics going around, or stand-up mics.
And maybe we could have some lights.
Right.
Is that possible,
yes.
so we can see you?
Anybody a question?
Is there anybody up there? Can you turn on the lights? No.
Okay.
They've gotten a coffee break.
So let me start by asking something. As you were speaking, one issue that I was very interested in was the street, the way you were speaking about it. And I think of the street as a place marked by indeterminacy, as opposed, you have heard me say this, Richard, as opposed to
Right.
the piazza, the piazza, which is the sort of the epitome of the public space in the European tradition, where you have embedded logics of conduct, there are codes. The street we don't know. And so I have sort of an observation is that a city for me needs a lot of indeterminacy. Otherwise you have something that is
Right.
over-organized. And so I was wondering about the street. You focused a lot on the street. Can you sort of connect it a bit with this issue of indeterminacy, and to what extent, at one point you were talking about an empty street, right, or a street where people cannot be.
Right.
Is that still a street, would be one question, or is that such an overdetermined space that it really is not? Can you sort of reflect?
Well, the whole notion of this closed city is that there's a tight fit between form and function. That's what happens in a closed city. That the fit between form and function becomes one-to-one. The Haussmannian city is one version of that tight fit. That is, all the forms are calculated because he had very clear functions in mind. So in that sense, it's really indeterminate. That's the purpose of it. And when the pissoir and the cafe arise, he doesn't know what the devil to do, because, well, he's senile by that point, by 1875. But the whole project is disoriented. And I want to say something about that. This is a really basic issue in thinking about urban form. We still are thinking in this determinate way, in which there's a one-to-one correspondence between form and function in many, many different domains. And the result of it is that when something in the environment changes, that the whole point of what we've made is disrupted. I see this in Mazadar now and Songdo, which are so-called smart cities, which are in fact too tightly planned. You can talk to be smart. But what happened was that basically Paris took back the streets by making them indeterminate in the later 19th century. And then the powers that be have taken back streets. Robert Moses in this country, by once again telling what a street is for, what purpose a particular street serves. You don't have a multiplicity of functions, you have a fit between a single function on the street and its form. So this whole question about indeterminacy is the other side of the notion, in this case, of making motion take precedence over space.
Very good. Well, maybe we should end with that final thought of yours.
Okay.
Which is a very good one. I like that.
I'm glad.
Yes. Thank you very much, Richard. So I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, Eric Miller. Eric Miller is the chair of the Transportation Research Board. This is a very long title here. Research Board Committee on travel behavior and values. So you know everything about us when it comes to, where are you, Eric? To the travel dimension. He's a professor of civil engineering and the director of the Transportation Research Institute at the University of Toronto, with degrees from the University of Toronto and MIT, a PhD. And his research interests include analysis and modeling of urban form, travel behavior interactions, agent-based microsimulation modeling, and sustainable urban transportation planning. Eric, and I invite you to come and speak. And I have a big red clock for our speakers. There you go. That's the only clock that works for me.
Great. Well, thank you, Saskia, very much for inviting me. It's my great pleasure to be here. Can you hear me? So what I want to do is, let's see how this work. There we go. To a certain extent, I think, step back a little bit from the question of mobility systems, which I understood one way or another we would be talking about today. And I'm struck by, I'm always amazed how these things work out, in that we had, other than a couple fascinating emails from Saskia, we had no instructions in terms of what to talk about or what real sense of what anybody else was going to talk about. But already, I mean, just in Saskia's opening comments, she talked about technologies confronting the city and the city speaking back. And I would say cities do speak back. And so what I want to do today, as an engineer, and I don't know if I'm the only engineer in this crowd or not, but probably one of few, I think it's important to understand a bit about what I'm coming to call the physics of transportation. I mean, the transportation is a technology, or multiple technologies, but there are actually physical limits and constraints and relationships that we have to understand in designing any mobility system. It's sort of like, I'm a Trekkie Scotty saying to Captain Kirk, Captain, you cannot defy the laws of physics. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind in terms of thinking about mobility systems in cities. But the second part of my talk is I also believe that we can't talk about transportation in absence of the context and its interrelationship with urban form and the city at large. And I think this, in this respect, in my own way, I'll be talking about how the city talks back to the transportation technology and certainly affects it. And then I'm going to try to bring these things together in terms of a concept that I call accessibility, because in transportation planning, we use the two terms mobility and accessibility, and even though they sound very similar, they are actually, and they are related, I think they are something different, and I'd like to try to talk about that. And also following on from Richard, I'm not a historian, but I think, again, very compatibly, and I won't coming at it from a fairly different point of view, but just to note that transportation technology, political implications aside and so forth, has fundamentally obviously shaped cities over time. And in my very simplistic view, we've gone through at least three major eras with some transitions in between, as talked about by Richard, in terms of the fundamental technologies that have been available to us, the mobility systems available to us, that have had profound impacts on what we can do with cities. And the first, obviously, was the pre-industrial city. We've already heard something about that. Then clearly, with some intermediate transitions, the industrial city, the industrialization and the mechanization of transportation. It did vastly increase the speed with which we could move, vastly increase the capacity with which we could move people, and allowed cities to expand dramatically in size, geographic size, and population. And this went hand in glove with the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution largely occurred within cities, the factories and so forth. Those factories needed a labor force. We needed larger cities. Following that technological determinism, the factories attracted people. People had to have someplace to live. We had to be able to move those people. The availability of mass transportation for the first time in history profoundly profoundly changed the cities in a variety of ways. And then going on from that, obviously in the last 100 years and more than 100 years, we've been building the automobile city, and we already heard about cars a lot today already, and we'll talk more about them. Obviously the car has also profoundly shaped the city, permitting the city to take on, encouraging the city to take on a much different forms as well. And of course we still have the layer of the public transportation that we started building in the 19th century, overlaid with the automobile city. Cities such as New York or Toronto, where I come from, London, Paris, from a transportation point of view, are layered cities in which we have all three of these eras of technology, of transportation technology, overlaid on one another. We still walk and bike. We still have public transit. We still have cars. And the city, from an urban forum point of view and a transportation point of view, is the intersection between all these technologies operating at the same time, but obviously with the car being by far the dominant mode of transportation. And the challenge with that is that we've discovered, perhaps to our chagrin or our surprise, or maybe not our surprise, depending on how thoughtful we were about it, that as cities grow large, over and above any other considerations that we might have about these technologies and their social, economic, or political, cultural impacts, is that the car simply doesn't scale well as cities get very large. And this is where the physics of transportation starts to come in. That there is something called the fundamental flow equation that says there's a fundamental relationship on average between flow, speed, and the density of that flow. And this is simply physics. It's simply, these are what we call time-space diagrams. The vertical axis is location along a roadway, or it could be a street, versus time on the horizontal axis. The traces are trajectories of individual vehicles, or it could be bicycles or pedestrians. And if we just do the math on that and count the number of cars passing a point over time, that's flow. At any time, looking over a stretch of roadway or sidewalk, how many cars or people are there? Count that. That's a density, and and we can compute the speed at which people are traveling. Average flow equals average speed times average density on average. And this fundamental relationship, this is physics, governs the movement of all vehicles, all bicycles, all pedestrians. Transit's a little different, at least in terms of subways and so on. And so this fundamentally constrains what we can accomplish with a transportation system. And this is what we call a speed flow diagram. This is a typical, each dot is an observation at some point in time on a particular location on a highway. This is a classic relationships that we get between speed and flow. And what this is telling us is that red line is the approximate capacity of this roadway. And that's an emergent property. We can actually figure out what the capacity will be and design a roadway for a certain capacity, but that capacity is actually an emergent outcome of vehicles interacting and trying to move along the roadway. It's a function of the vehicle technology, it's a function of the speed limit and rules of behavior, because we don't always go by the speed limit, but it's fundamentally vehicles interacting with one another on a roadway give rise to that there's a maximum throughput we can put through this. And this applies to bicycles, it applies to pedestrians. The shape, the numbers will be different, but this is the emergent outcome. So changing the technology might change that capacity a bit. Over time, when I started as a grad student, that red line was we thought that we could get about 2,000 vehicles per hour per lane on a highway. That's actually crept up to about 2,400 because cars do drive faster, they have better braking systems. People have gotten used to driving in crowded conditions and will tolerate driving faster, closer to each other. So the capacity of our roads have actually gone up simply because of those technology changes. But they can't go any further. Autonomous connected vehicles that speak to one another on the roadway, which are coming, might change this somewhat. We might get up to, 3,000, 3,500, but it won't change the fundamental shape of that curve. And so one of the implications of this is that there's not a tech fix out there that's going to fundamentally, for example, get rid of congestion on our highways because the fundamental physics won't allow it. So from a traffic control problem, if we are trying to deal with this transportation system, We'd like to be up in that green area, what we call undersaturated conditions, where we are putting as many cars, if that's what we want to do, through the system as we can. And the problem we have in all our urban areas is too often we're operating in the red area when we the classic morning or afternoon traffic jam is that once we get into that turbulent, chaotic kind of behavior, not only do speeds go down, but we actually lose throughput. We actually lose capacity in the system. A roadway is a very dynamic, complex little system itself. And so our challenge over and above everything else, as long as we're going to try to keep these systems, is to can we actually keep people up in the green area? And one of the objectives of road pricing and different types of control strategies is try to maintain that throughput. But the basic fundamental problem of highways, again, is that we do have this sort of time versus volume sort of relationship, that it's a queuing process, it's a nonlinear process, we get congestion because of cars interacting, and there are, again, very fundamental limits on how much traffic we can put through and the speeds associated with that. And so again, if we can only get 2,000 to 2,400 cars per hour per lane on a highway, and we get much less on city streets, it's 1,800 cars per hour per lane if the street is operating really, really, really well. Imagine Manhattan or London or Paris or Toronto or Los Angeles or Beijing or any other place trying to exist only with streets and cars and highways. It can't be done. You couldn't move the number of people that are in Manhattan right now, going to work, school, shopping, whatever. You couldn't move them in and out and through Manhattan if all you had was the road system. So obviously, the promise of the car as the ultimate mobility tool simply doesn't work in big cities. In little towns, I mean, that's fine. Villages, rural areas, that's another set of conversations about mobility systems. But in big cities, the car isn't the answer, and the more we continue to build cities in that way, it simply doesn't work. Now, Richard talked about walking and biking. Obviously, great things to do if the trip lengths are such that we can accommodate them. One of the things we have to understand, though, however, again, particularly in big cities, is not everybody can live and work within walking or biking distance. Not everybody can live and work and shop within an area, at least in the way we've organized ourselves and at least in the way in terms of the opportunities we want to engage in and so forth. And so if we can't walk and bike for all our trips, and if the car isn't the solution, then public transit, in some way, shape, or form or another, is necessary for the movement of the volumes of people that we have to accommodate in a large city over the distances that inevitably we have to accommodate. And we have currently many existing transit technologies, from the lowly bus up to subways and commuter rail. They have different capacities to carry people, and if we can match capacity, the capacity to the need, we can optimize the system. And this does come back to the circulatory sort of model that Richard talks about. These days we talk about biomimicry. You look at a transportation network, it does look exactly like a circulatory system. There is an argument, at least if we are trying to solve the problem of moving people, nature figured out how to do that efficiently. This is an efficient way of moving people. So again, the focus in this conversation is, given that we have millions and millions of people to move, I don't know, in the New York region, 30 million trips a day, I don't know. In Toronto, it's about 15 million, we're about half your size. Just as a practical problem, we have to, presumably make sense to try to move those people efficiently, assuming we have to move them. And certainly we see in all great cities, the transit networks are essential. Again, this city that we're in right now could not exist, could not function without its subway system and its rail and bus systems and so forth. And the challenge is for those systems to work and be efficient is they have to attract people. People have to be able to choose to go to travel that way rather than taking a car. Because most people, obviously not all people, but most people actually do have a choice in terms of taking transit or taking car and so forth. And if they're going to be attracted to transit, it has to provide a viable type of service to people, an attractive service. And that, in transit's complicated because with a car it's relatively simple. You walk out, maybe take the elevator down to the garage, whatever, get in the car, drive, find a parking spot, walk not too far to your destination. Transit, you have to walk out to the bus stop. You have to wait for the bus. The bus has to come. Maybe the bus takes you to the subway. You transfer. Subway takes you someplace. Maybe you walk to your final destination. So it's a complex little tour in itself. All of those components are important to us. And so in order to provide the technology, has to be able to try to provide short walk times, ideally. And we do that by having short stop spacing and high network density. We want to minimize wait and transfer times. That means trying to minimize station dwell times, trying to have ideally we want to have high frequency of service, but then from the operational point of view, there's things we have to do in terms of control systems and vehicle technology and so on to try to provide high frequencies of service. And yes, if we want to be addressing speed, if we want to move people, we have to move people over relatively long distances. Presumably we want to do that faster than slower, so speeds are important. But actually the actual vehicle speeds are probably not usually as important in terms of people's perception of the trip and the attractiveness of the trip as the walk and the wait time. If you, in a 40-minute trip each morning commuting, at least 10 minutes of that might be walking to and from transit. Another 10 minutes might be wait time and so forth. So maybe only 20 minutes is the actual vehicle time. If you want to save people 5 minutes of time, and maybe that's the difference between them taking it or not, the wait and walk times may be the ways you can improve the attractiveness rather than the in-vehicle time. Coming back again to the circulatory system, if transit is going to be an attractive alternative to the road system, and certainly on the road system we've built a hierarchical circulatory network, the transit system has to be the same way. In particular, in order to provide that fine-grained access, initial access, we need typically high-frequency, low-speed, low-capacity buses and so forth to provide that fine-grained access, but that has to feed into a larger, higher capacity, higher speed, longer distance network. And so building that network and that hierarchical network is essential if this transit technology is to provide the mobility we need. Just to illustrate this, and this is the sort of thing I actually do in my research, is we can actually build models that try to predict the behavior of people. These are probabilistic models. People are inherently unpredictable, but in a statistical sense, for planning purposes, we can actually do a fairly good job of that. So we can try to capture what I've just been saying in terms of what we call random utility models, in which we say, okay, people are actually fairly rational, and in all my work I've actually come to that conclusion that people actually do more or less take what they think is the best mode of travel at that time for them. Doesn't make too much sense. I'm going to work and I'm going to take a path that I think is worse than something else that's available to me. I don't think many people do that each day. So we try to capture that in at least a probabilistic way, so we can talk about the utility of the transit mode as being a function of the various travel times, the costs, other attributes, and so forth, and all the other modes, the same sort of thing. And we can actually construct a mathematical model in which the vertical axis here is the probability of a person in their actual choice context taking transit versus the utility of transit minus, and in this particular functional form it is a difference between sort of my next best alternative. And we get a classic S-shaped sort of curve. If the utilities, if you're indifferent between the two, you have a 50-50 probability. If transit's worse, you have less of a probability. And if transit's better, you have a greater than 50% probability. Clearly, if we are concerned about the amount of car usage going on in our city, we would like to be at least here and possibly over here in terms of the attractiveness of transit. The problem, this is data from Toronto. This is actual data from Toronto. This curve is sort of the cumulative curve in terms of the number of trips occurring in the morning peak period, work trips in the morning peak period in Toronto a couple years ago, our last survey. And what we see is the vast majority of trips in the Toronto region, and Toronto is considered a relatively transit-oriented place, not quite as much as New York, is in fact those trips are occurring in an environment which is very unattractive to transit. It's a very auto-dominated environment. And that really leads me to the second part of what I'm trying to say, and I'm taking way too long on this, is that the reason of that is because of the way we've built the city. That the urban form is such that it's very auto-oriented, not very transit-oriented. And that there is a fundamental transportation and activity system, or urban system interaction, and the travel demand we see existing in every city every day is the emergent outcome of the interaction of the supply and performance of transportation interacting with the city. And this is where the city speaks back, because given what we're trying to do, that manifests itself in terms of realized demand on the system. And that demand feeds back both in terms of our activities. We modify our activities in response to our experience, among other things, with the transportation system. If something's too congested to get to, we may go to a different shopping center and so forth. But that experience of the system actually flows back and modifies the transportation system as well. So we have a very complicated system of demand and supply interacting between these systems, the system of systems that we call a city. And urban form does affect travel behavior, the number of vehicles per household, and the average vehicle kilometers per vehicles per household depends on, this is urban density, household density here. Denser areas, we require fewer vehicles. This is household density again. The amount of vehicle kilometers traveled per day on average goes dramatically down with density. This is Toronto. This is downtown Toronto right here, the central business district. This is moving out into the more rural areas. This is plotting the average CO2 produced by people traveling by all modes of transportation on an average day. As we move away from the downtown, we get higher and higher automobile usage, longer and longer trips, and hence more and more CO2. And in fact, we actually spend more on transportation. This is the total annual transportation costs for households in the Toronto area. And again, as we move away from downtown, cars are very expensive to own and maintain and operate, and so people actually spend more and more of their income on average as they move out into urban areas. So, and this is just illustrating that, talking about this, just the macro design of sort of where population and employment in big chunks are, sort of the macro arrangement of the urban area, but the actual urban design, the street system, the mixed usage within the streets and so forth, both are important in terms of determining automobile usage versus other modes, and hence things like the amount of greenhouse gases being generated. Now, bringing these things together leads to this notion of accessibility. And I would argue, and most transportation planners would argue, that the actual objective of the transportation system is not mobility. It's not moving people. It's accessibility. It's creating and by accessibility we mean the potential to interact. And I think this comes back to even the issue of indeterminacy of streets and the fact that, Paris surprised Haussmann with doing different things on the streets. Cities are incredibly dynamic, self-adapting, emergent systems. We can't predict what's going to happen tomorrow in the city in many respects. And so what the transportation system ideally should be doing is maximizing the potential to interact. So as the city evolves, we have the greatest opportunity to interact with accessibility to jobs, accessibility to schools, accessibility to shopping, accessibility to each other, the opportunity to interact. And that can include on-the-street interactions. Communications comes in as an alternative to transportation. We can interact through communication systems rather than transportation. And the argument is that by thinking in terms of accessibility, it frees us from the silo of thinking about, okay, how do we make cars more efficient, or how do we make even buses more efficient? It's not about the efficiency of that movement. It's not about the mobility. It's about, can we, by providing this system, this is a tool, transportation is an enabling technology that allows us to do the things we want to do and the things we need to do. And in particular, the notion of this accessibility is each point in space has accessibility to all sorts of things. So we're right here in Avery Hall right now. We have access to a certain number of restaurants for lunchtime. We have access to libraries. We have access to all sorts of things here. Move half a mile away, you have a different accessibility at that point. And accessibility is the combination of the attractiveness of opportunities in space and our ability to reach there. So it is that intersection fundamentally of the transportation system with the urban form. So if I'm in a location where I have, I'm out in the middle of the prairie someplace, I have this maybe a great highway that I can blast away at, at 100 miles an hour if I want to, because there's nobody else on the highway, but so I have great speed, great reach, but there's no place to go. There's no restaurants. I have no accessibility. On the other hand, if there's lots of, if I'm a poor person without a car in an area with no transit, and there's lots of grocery stores, but I can't get to them, I have no accessibility. So it's that intersection between the ability to move, the mobility, and the opportunities, the attractiveness of the places I can reach with that mobility. That's what accessibility is all about. We can measure accessibility in various ways. The simplest way is just to say, how many stores can I reach in a 30-minute drive or a 10-minute or 30-minute transit ride? So, I can draw a circle around a point, count the number of opportunities within that threshold, and compute it for that point. And this is just showing, again, for Toronto, this is for the shading in each zone, each traffic zone, is the accessibility from that point to how many jobs I can reach within 30 minutes by car. And this is downtown Toronto, lots of employment, so accessibility to jobs actually declines. As you move to the suburbs, you have less access to jobs because you're further away from them. This also illustrates the difference between, this is rush hour traffic, which is very congested, but the accessibility by car, despite that, is much higher than the accessibility by transit in Toronto. Here's the transit one, and if you could actually see it, the scale here is much smaller, so it's even worse than it looks. So even though downtown Toronto has reasonably good transit accessibility, why do 60, 70, 80% of all people drive? Is because despite the congestion, despite everything, as a practical fact, the car provides higher levels of accessibility. Now, we can get a little more fancy mathematical, going back to those probability choice models that I say we build and we actually use in planning agencies. This is what it looks like, the probability of choosing one alternative, let's say a destination, given that I'm located I'm here, what's the probability I visit someplace else? We can actually, given that sort of a model, we can define accessibility. Another definition of accessibility is the expected utility I will get. If I make a trip, what utility, what benefit will I get? And we can actually, again, at least with this model, we can actually compute that. We can actually compute that expected maximum utility, and we can define, and it turns out just to be this, the math doesn't matter, but the fact is it's computable under these assumptions. But that's, in my view, and again, lots of people will argue in transportation planning, this is a legitimate definition of accessibility. Accessibility is the benefit I get by being here and my access to opportunities. It can also be shown within economic theory that that's consumer surplus. So the argument is that, in fact, accessibility is the social welfare, the social well-being, the consumer surplus associated with the transportation system, and hence, arguably, a fairly fundamental thing. And so, again, coming back to the car, the dilemma that we have with the car is that it promises great accessibility. It promises high speed. It promises all sorts of access. And again, in some situations that holds, but in high density, in large cities, two things happen. First of all, that promise of access encourages and almost always induces sprawl. People will take advantage of that ability to travel faster, further, to spread out, to consume more land, and there's lots of other modernist planning processes and so on that encourage this, but things spread out. And so there's this contradiction. We increase the speed, but we also thin things out and spread things out. So does accessibility actually go up or down with the automobile? Well, it depends, but very often, arguably, it actually goes down. The automobile's promise is a false one. But that's before we take congestion into account. Certainly with congestion, eventually the problem becomes a false one because we lose the speed. So that promise of speed is actually taken away from us. This is kind of an unintended and perhaps almost perverse city speaking back to the technology, and so we actually lose accessibility. So there's many policy implications. I'm taking up too much time here, so we'll skip over that. And so the basic argument is that we should be thinking about accessibility, how our mobility systems contribute to accessibility. With that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
We do have 2 mic standing here if anybody has a question. I have, let you speak for quite a while. I could have chopped the time off, but it was absolutely worthwhile. So while some people might be preparing for a question, I'm very interested. I heard you make an assertion that I had never heard before, and I find it absolutely fascinating, which is that the car, the physics of the car, no matter what we do with that car, prevents it from scaling up or from being, it doesn't scale. You said the car doesn't scale. And I think, I am not a transport expert, I think people know that, but I find that an absolutely, and then secondly, the whole notion of the physics of the car, and then I want to talk physics of the city. Is there a foundational asymmetry between the physics of the car and the physics of the city, so that there is no way, there is no solution once the car achieves, the numbers of cars? Is that really quite so? Is it?
Yeah, that's my belief. So, going back to the numbers, and one of the reasons I show it, about 2,000 vehicles per hour in a congested situation. Not many people in those cars. So we have an expressway coming in downtown Toronto called the Gardner Expressway. It has 3 lanes. Being generous, maybe it can move 7,500 people an hour. We have the Yonge Street subway, similar to your subways. It moves 35,000 people an hour. That's 14 lanes of highway. You can't, so let's say, imagine, take all your subways out of New York, how many lanes of traffic, and then parking the cars. We haven't talked about parking. So yes, I think our fundamental dilemma in the car-oriented city is the two physics don't match. Yeah. They fundamentally don't match.
Is there a mobility? You said bikes are a solution, walking is a solution, but when you take the physics of the city, and a city will have a certain kind of, expanse, if you want, there is an asymmetry there as well, in a way, right?
Yeah, and
there is no way of fully having a satisfying model for mobilities in cities. Is that what?
Well, I haven't quite given up on that, but walking and biking, I don't think are
enough. Exactly.
But you need an urban form
don't get upset, Walter.
urban form that encourages that locally. Yeah. But you're never going to have total self-containment, and I think that would be self-defeating in the city. You say, you can only stay in your community. You don't want to go out there. You don't want to interact. So what you need is transit that's connecting these things together, so that you have, ideally, the ability to travel longer distances.
So that would also mean that urban planning, architecture, urban design, all of those should be playing a far more active and knowing role, right, in designing
That's right.
space, besides public transport, which clearly is an absolute necessity. Okay, I have many more questions.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Take the 2 questions and then.
Yeah, and I'll try to be brief in my response, which is difficult.
Thanks a lot for your very interesting presentation. A bit beyond my payroll in maths, I always fail that. But my question has to do with whether you have factored in non-physical variables into your models, like namely culture and politics. In 10 or 20 seconds, let me expand. The U.S. is known for being the automobile nation. And it's something that is in the city. But it's not just the U.S. I come from a town or a country where we have a joke that to prove your bona fide middle class status, you have to own a car. At my time, it was the R4, tiny Renault, made in Colombia, but it also boosted our sense of nationalities. But also the American visa and the mortgage apartment. So that's the problem when you attempt to control, as it happens here as well, in a town like New York. Remember what Bloomberg's fiasco with the congestion tax? And the other thing is the politics. I read somewhere, not in a book, but in a tourist guide, that the GM, it's a good time to malign GM this week, correct? GM somehow conspired to take the trams rails in LA in the forest. I don't know whether it is urban legend, no pun intended, So have you factored culture and politics in your models?
Well, in the models, politics don't show up in the models. Culture, to a certain extent, in the sense these models all have parameters in them that reflect current, I would say, perceptions and attitudes. One of our challenges is trying to predict how they may actually change over time. But I think the cultural attitudes towards cars and suburban living, et cetera, what we've been, certainly in this continent, been raised to expect or experience is a major issue. So one of the challenges is how do you change that? How do you evolve that over time? And I think it is evolving. We're seeing a re-urbanization of culture. I mean, people are returning to the cities for voluntarily for a bunch of reasons. The politics are something we're trying to influence with the models, trying to show people the evidence about if you do this versus that. And yeah, the GM story in Los Angeles is something we can talk about over coffee. I mean, it's absolutely true. But,
It's absolutely true.
yes. Yeah.
Interesting. Wow.
Yeah.
So, hey, Adam Greenfield, LSE Cities. So as somebody hugely skeptical about information technology and profoundly convinced that the car is a deeply anti-urban intervention, you're forcing me into the really unusual position of thinking that you've given really short shrift to the future potential of the automobile as a mass transit enabler when coupled, non-mechanically, over a wireless network, that information technology can bind together cars in platoon formations and extremely high speed irrigation.
Yeah. And if I had allowed myself more time and not tried to cram too many ideas into one presentation, I would have been happy to talk about that because I agree. I mean, I think there are several autonomous connected vehicles are going to change mobility in cities. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And maybe that's something we can talk about further as the day goes on. I think as a transit, as an enabler of getting people to high capacity, I mean, again, this notion, we have walkable, bikeable neighborhoods, but we have to get to the subway or the commuter rail to get someplace far away. One of the problems with that is what we call the first last mile. We can't get there cost effectively. So if an autonomous, driverless vehicle could come pick me up and take me to the train station, that would change things. Highways, particularly, I think, platooning cars, we will increase the capacity of highways. My concern, this is something I actually want to do analysis on, what happens to get the access ramp? I don't think the connected vehicles will have nearly as much impact. They will have impact on the streets, but I think that'll be the limiting factor on how much they buy us on the freeways, because you have to get off the freeway eventually. But it's going to come. It's going to improve things. But I think we're early days in finding out exactly how big. Is it 5%, 10%, 50%? That's what we don't know.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Our next speaker in this panel is John Urry, a distinguished professor of sociology at Lancaster University and the author of many books. John has also been somebody who has been very active in the UK, especially in the public domain, dealing with a whole variety of issues, and a truly engaged social scientist, and the author of many, many books. So among them, there is a book called Mobilities, which I love, the simplicity of that title. Then there is Mobilities. That's already a little step down, John, from the elegance of Mobilities, I would say. Then we have Mobile Lives. Very nice. The latest book that is going to be coming out is Offshoring by Polity. And you are also the founding co-editor of a journal called Mobilities. John.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me. And I'll begin with this nice bag for Fossil, the company, where you can see the globe encircled by cars, car after car after car. So I think that kind of captures the sort of issue that I want to deal with. In fact, the previous previous speakers referred on one moment to 1841, and 1841 was a very interesting moment when it was the beginning of the first railway age,
in England. And secondly, in 1841 was the first ever package tour organised by Thomas Cook. And those were also very fateful for the trajectories of mobilities in and between cities. The previous speaker, Eric, very much referred to the importance of systems and emergent effects. And I'm interested here in the system of automobility, thinking of it as a socio-technical system. And it's a socio-technical system organised around astonishing transformations in the production and burning of various kinds of energy sources. And energy, I think, is utterly central to thinking and imagining different kinds of ways in which cities might be mobilised and providing accessibility. We know that the energy use since, say, 1900 has been on an astonishing scale, and yet there is no substitute for energy, and it may well be that the energy that made possible the mass movement of the 20th century by motor vehicles may be coming to something of an ending. Energy resources are scarce. Even if demand doesn't increase, there could be not more than 40 odd years of oil left. And I did produce a book last year called Societies Beyond Oil, and oil will play something of a role in this paper. This was a very significant moment, the first ever oil gusher in 1901 in Texas. You probably know the movie, There Shall Be Blood, and that movie captured the sort of the astonishment that people had when they saw oil spouting out of the ground and appeared to be providing new ways of almost free oil-based movement. And of course that led to the car, but I think it's very important not to see the car as merely a means of transportation. So it's not just a car. It's in some ways the quintessential manufactured object, the major item of individual consumption. It's an extraordinarily powerful machinic complex. It's the predominant global form of quasi-private mobility. It's a dominant culture and has sustained many discourses of what constitutes the good life, what is necessary for citizenship, and it has provided potent literary, artistic, and filmic and advertising images and symbols. That goes back to the question about culture that we were discussing just now. And it's also the single most important form of environmental use. It's not just a means of transporting people, and it has many other affordances. And thus, as a system, it transforms the environment, the fitness landscape within which it operates. It adapts as it spreads along the paths, taking over the streets in Paris or wherever, draws in many other aspects of its environment, which become reconstituted as components of its system. It provides notions of convenience. It often, in a way, provides an apparent solution to the problems which it itself has created. It has the effect of externalizing danger and risk, often on those other people who inhabit those streets, especially in developing countries, and is obviously essential, as I've said before, to the individualist, consumerist, affective culture of contemporary capitalism. So changing automobility is never a question of individual behaviour, but of systems and social practices being transformed. So I think the question of habits are very significant here. Habits are derived from systems. Systems show no tendency, in fact the opposite, they show no tendency to move towards equilibrium. These systems, especially automobility as a system, is a kind of simultaneous economic, physical, technological, political, and social system, socio-technical system. These are often linked together in various kinds of ways. And systems, once established, get locked in. I think the importance of path dependence and lock-in for thinking about the car for our system is absolutely crucial. Systems are, of course, also clustered, and habits are a key part of those systems. So there's actually a reproduction of the same photograph. I see here. It's obviously the best photograph to demonstrate this point. But what this shows is the mass organized character. These are habits. These form and perpetuate and reproduce habits. And so telling people you shouldn't drive from X to Y, you shouldn't use a car, you should do this or this. This is not the question. The question is, how do you subvert these system characteristics? And one of the real issues that I referred to before is the way in which oil makes the world go round. Many people have said money makes the world go round. I think oil is actually just as significant from 1901. And it is extraordinary that the systems of mass movement are almost all dependent upon one resource, black gold. 95% or more of transportation energy comes from oil. Oil has many other uses as well, and is an astonishingly significant resource, a kind of magic resource really, which has been used, or has been, actually we should much more say burnt during the 20th century to fuel all of that movement. It's burning, which is such a problem. And another image, if we'd asked people in 1901, is this where you would like to end up? Would this be a good outcome? I think we would probably conclude, no, we're not planning that. Of course, that's an extreme image, but nevertheless, you kind of get to the point. This was a perverse set of consequences which led to this outcome. And it's also interesting, historically, that, of course, the oil-based movement was not inevitable at all. And in the late 19th century, there were alternatives. And in fact, I rather like this vehicle, which was the first car ever to travel over 60 miles an hour, and it was a battery-based vehicle in 1899. And indeed, and if you wanted an electric or battery-based vehicle, this was one possibility, but you could also have had this rather stylish electric model. And it was by no means inevitable that oil would be the sort of fuel of preference. And it was somewhat contingent. Partly it was contingent on the spurting of oil out of the ground in the early years of the 20th century in the United States. That had many fateful, very, very fateful consequences. Of course, it's had the consequences to do with the unending increase in global carbon emissions, and the role which was mentioned in the previous lecture on the ways in which the burning of all of that oil and gas and coal, the three fossil fuels, would appear to have change something which scientists had theoretically established as being possible, but which they never really expected would happen. That is to change global climate. And I mentioned some of the sorts of apparent consequences of that. I'm not going to go particularly through the detail of that. But the global insurance industry is very interesting. And if you read their reports and so on, they are utterly clear that the burning of all of that fuel and energy resources has had the effect of transforming is transforming climate, and these are some images from the city we're in, which I think are very striking. But there's a strange combination here. There's both this effect and the effect that, and the consequence that it appears that there are going to be major shortages of oil, one of those fossil fuels, and is the fossil fuel upon which transportation energy has come to be based. This is from the International Energy Authority. Many other reports say something similar. So how to break from the car, to move beyond the car? And so systems have to change, but systems are extraordinarily difficult to change. And I very much like this observation from Brian Arthur, who says that a revolution doesn't arrive until we reorganize our activities around its technologies, until those technologies adapt themselves to us. The new domain, such as a post-car system, whatever that might be, I think we're going to hear more about that later, must gain adherence and prestige. It must find purposes and uses. And this will take decades. No new big socio-technical system got introduced and innovated overnight. It will necessarily take decades. And during this time, the old technology lives on. So what will futures be like? Well, it is obviously very important not to think of technology as transforming the futures, because technologies are always embedded, and they're embedded in what I would loosely call social practices. So there are extensive ties between innovators. There must be transformations in the social practices, or what was called earlier the sort of forms of accessibility, which would make possible an alternative. And innovations also involve, I think, something very interesting, which is the process of what we might call sync, or synchronization, between the different elements and components of innovation scattered around the world. How do those come together to form, to synchronize, so that in a way lots of different innovators are coming to kind of speak to the same set of issues? And that's relevant to what I like to call the International Division of Innovative Labour. How does that come to fit together? So I've thought a little bit about this. Also, there are also many things to do with governance, which came up a little bit already, and which I guess is something we need to very much bear in mind. How do cities and their governance structures play a role in enabling and facilitating the synchronization kind of around the world of what might turn out to be a different kind of system? And that is a very significant challenge, I think, for cities and their forms of governance. Often partly, of course, because cities are supposedly always competing against each other. And that's the kind of the last thing they really ought to be doing. So I then have constructed this rather, list, really, long list of things that would possibly make up an alternative socio-technical system. And as you can see, it's a kind of mixture of politics, governance, social life, technology, the materials out of which vehicles might be powered and constructed, the relationships between the technology of movement and other kinds of things. Very important are the sorts of things that Adam was referred to in his question just now. There are many different kinds of changing the environment within which the mere vehicle might come to be organized. And I have another way of connecting that, which I think is quite clever, but it sort of says everything interacts with everything else, which is, of course, true. But the question is, how might that come to take place? And around the world, there are, of course, hundreds, thousands of innovators in different cities and places, innovating different bits of that system. But the question is the sort of the bringing those together to form what I call a post-car system. And this repeats some of those points. This could be a sort of system which would have the effect of displacing, but the question of displacement is also very tricky, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So what likelihood is any of this to have any effect? Well, there is some what we might call straws in the wind. There's an interesting book, Mobility in Transition, not involving me, but Frank Heel's one of the most interesting writers on socio-technical transitions theory, is involved in trying to demonstrate quite interesting array of cracks, as he puts it, in the car or automobility system. And one of those, which I think is interesting, you're probably familiar with this data from the United States. Is the plateauing of car travel, something borne out by data in quite a number of other, quote, Western countries, and also survey evidence that young people are less likely than in the past to have a car license, let alone to have access to a car. So that's interesting. This article suggests that there's a plateauing, at least, or possibly a peaking of car-based travel in Western countries, not, of course, in the BRIC countries, and especially not in India and China. So it's a kind of only of limited significance. But what this does, in my mind, is to raise the issue as to how is system change, what is involved in system change. And the futurist Buckminster Fuller, who I think is a brilliantly interesting commentator on a lot of this, says, you never change anything by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model, a new system that over time will come to make the existing model obsolete. That's very interesting. And in a way, the history of mobile telephony replacing landline phones very well demonstrates. It wasn't that the mobile phone kind of directly challenged and directly replaced landline telephony, but, there was a new system, quite different system, different technology, and it led, of course, to many, many different social, let's just call them social communicative practices. And as a consequence of that has led to some significant decline in the use and significance of landline phones. So my question is it possible to think what would be the sort of vehicle equivalent to the mobile phone? that we can't come to constitute a system, or probably a sort of cluster of systems, that would over time lead the what I like to call the steel and petroleum car, of which there are about getting on for 1 billion around the world, as we see circling the world. Is it possible to imagine what would lead that sort of new system to displace, that over time would make the existing model obsolete, which of course leads to sort of, science fiction, fantasies and fictions and so on. So one sort of set of images might be a kind of a livable city, and that's one possible, and another possible one is much more a sort of digitized city, which we've just been discussing about. So I leave you with the images of these two possible future cities, the livable and the digital, and try to, and the question is, I think this will come up in subsequent talks, how do the, this is a challenge actually for the next speakers, to say how and what kind of system, postcar system we might be experiencing were we to be here in 30, 40 years' time.
Here are mics for questions. So let me ask you to think about this final notion that you're not going, you need to replace the existing technology with a better, more attractive, more compelling system. And in your mind, let me just backtrack. I think that is how change happens in complex systems. In other words, a given capability is not completely erased when foundational change happens. What does happen is that it switches, my language now, organizing logics. So your example is very good of that, right? The telephony is not gone out of the window, but the mode in which. So the organizing logic has changed. And when it comes to cars, or something that transports people with whatever they want to carry, what are our options? Because we can, of course, replace it with communication technologies. We can have mobility spaces, where cars, we can barely call them cars, you don't have to own the car. And that already is very important, I think. It changes the larger political economy. But how do we get away from needing something that carries more than a bike, that can take us a certain distance, and can we do without it? And I want to come back to this question, the incompatibility of the physics of the car, because it doesn't scale well, right, with the city, which is a very, scaled up system compared to a car, of course, right? And have you sort of had any speculative thoughts, fantasies at night when you didn't know anything what to do or anything like that?
Thanks. It's thanks for that easy question. And one of the reasons for all of that is that, of course, predominant factor transforming urban design over the course of this oil century, as I would call it, has been the proliferation of forms of transportation based around the privately owned and cherished motor car, and indeed of lorries, trucks, which transport the goods and services and so on. So it's not just actually just the car there; it's the system of freight distribution, the outer town supermarkets and so on and so forth. So the whole sort of world has got organised in and around that, and of course, all that pattern, and thus it's incredibly difficult to reverse that. And that's again a kind of system feature. There's a sort of momentum has been built up, which is so transformative, so that one cannot, in a sense, easily reverse. And so maybe 10 years or 10, 15 years ago, I would have said there was very little chance of reverse. But there are some things, and actually the straightforward embrace of the necessity and desirability of living a life in and through the motor vehicles is somewhat disrupted. You know, there are all sorts of new ideas of urban planning, design, and the ways in which you might get transformations that link together new digital technologies, new vehicle systems, and new kind of ways of living, which are linked together and through, I think, the sort of the kind of informational flow, global information flow of thousands, tens of thousands. I like to call, I've got this phrase as a sort of low carbon civil society, and the kind of possibilities of that low carbon civil society made up of many different people in all sorts of different countries being kind of coming to assemble. So that's sort of my loose notion there.
But one could also say, for instance, if 3D printing really takes off, a lot of what is now transported we would eventually make in smaller units. I don't mean that everyone would have the facilities, but you know, at the neighborhood level. I mean, there are, when you begin to look at all the innovations, you begin to see assemblages of elements that might indeed begin to reposition the question of mobility around certain issues. All right, yes, and do introduce yourself.
I'm Jonas Hagen. I'm a PhD student in urban planning here at Columbia University. Thanks for the fascinating talk. I was wondering, what if we thought of cars as a public health issue? So what if we thought of it the way we thought of cholera or smoking as a problem that claims 1.3 million lives annually around the world and has serious consequences for quality of life in our cities? How would that change then not fighting existing reality? So not thinking of it as a telephone, but thinking of it as a disease.
Yeah, no, that's a really very effective way of putting the point. Some people say that had the car been if the car, the steel and petroleum oil-based car, if that were introduced now, it would never get past regulators because it was far too dangerous and had far too dangerous a technology, that is of explosions in the engine. That's important. But of course, the ways it, as you rightly say, and one of the things that's interesting is if you costed the costs of those deaths and those injuries, you would get a phenomenal sum that would be generated, because it is so much more dangerous than any other form of machine-based movement. I think Sweden's very interesting because they've got this zero death vision. That their belief is there should be no deaths on roads in Sweden. And so, to a significant degree at least, their urban transport policy is organised around how to minimise it. Every death on a road is undesirable and should be replanned to avoid that. So And of course, the best statistics are collected by the World Health Organization, on which you've been citing there, car deaths and injuries.
So are you writing a dissertation about this, and when will it be done? It's already famous, your dissertation.
Yeah.
Right? Very good going. Thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, hello, my name is Tom Kirk. I'm director of Mobility Lab based in Arlington, Virginia. First of all, thank you for this wonderful conference. It's very interesting. As you looking into the future, after cars, there are beyond car automobiles, the petroleum automobile, based automobile, and our sprawled out communities that are based upon that. Do you envision that sprawl will become the slums of tomorrow as the busy have will contract based on not having that ability to be so mobile, or do you think we will just come up with some new contrivance that allows us to continue this effect?
Yeah, I think that's a really important issue, and it's of course particularly significant in North America, which has sort of led the world in sprawl, but of course is being copied certainly in the BRIC countries to a significant degree. I mean, in the book that I wrote, Societies Beyond Oil, I argued that a major cause of the economic financial collapse in 2007-8 was actually the changing oil price, and it was as much an oil crunch as it was a financial crunch, and that had the effect of making the rising price of oil made it living in far-flung North American suburbs much less viable, and thus was a major cause of the sort of subprime mortgage collapse, etc., etc. And as far as I understand, I'm not an expert.
That last part I will debate with you, but anyhow, the first part is absolutely I agree. We're old friends.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
I
that's
take
right.
liberty.
Yeah. That has clearly made quite a lot of those suburbs less viable, and the possibilities that thus that people will have to search and seek for developments and housing and activities in and around the sorts of transit mass transit systems is a probability, but of course what needs to happen is that on a global scale, and I suppose that's one of the main points I'm making. This is a global issue. What happens in any one country, even the US as the sort of centre of the world car industry in the 20th century, is less significant than what's going to happen globally, and we really have to kind of make some of these sorts of post-car innovations. They have to happen fast and furiously around the world.
Well, thank you. Oh, you were going to ask a question?
Yeah,
yes.
I'll try to make it very quick. We're at the situation in the country where we have the highest transit usership since the Eisenhower administration announced the interstate highway system, and we know what happened. There are two factors I'm wondering if you or your colleagues have looked at and how they may figure. One is the impact of hyper-speculation of real estate, particularly in global metropolitan areas, which displaces everything residential, institutional, job-creating activities that you need for artificial values. And the second thing is, even within the green realm, when we're talking about the built environment, there seems to be a disconnect with regards to sourcing locally or regionally. And I will give a very quick example. A few years ago, a doc came out called Southie. It was about building a green building in South Boston. But they were sourcing as far as Chile, Australia, and China, which of course made the structure completely ungreen, a complete lack of understanding that part of the process is doing as much as closely as you possibly can, using those materials and sources and et cetera. So anything you could comment?
I completely agree about the significance of both of those, and especially of the financialization of property and of indebtedness, and the ways in which and indeed also the speculation about on oil futures as well, which is actually pretty interesting. There are 75 financial derivatives, oil-based derivatives. So that's one enormously difficult thing, and I suppose that's a kind of beyond our questions here, but is absolutely central to urban design and planning and finance and governance, is how to offset And in fact, in this new book of mine on offshoring, how to offset the scale, reach and importance of offshored financial flows and indeed taxation revenues is a massive challenge, and it's a massive challenge which is also relevant to the question of non-local resource sourcing of all sorts of supplies and resources and so on, which goes back to the one possibility of the at least in some degree of so-called 3D printing, which I've written a little bit about on whether that's a possible way in which there are localized regional sources of manufacturing, and at least freight and retailing possibly becomes more localized.
Well, thank you very much. By the way, the next meeting, we will take a shorter break. We're running a bit late, so try to be back here in 10 minutes. How's that? And then we go into digital technology. Thank you very, very much.